For those who have joined us, thanks so much for being here tonight. We're going to obviously give it a few minutes for other folks to find the link and hop on. But thanks for being here, and feel free to use the chat or the Q&A to introduce yourselves and let us know where you're from. I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes. Looks like a few more people might be trickling in here. If you're just joining us, thanks for being here tonight. We're getting a few more minutes, and then we'll get started talking to Maurice and Dave tonight. All right, I've given it a few extra minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started with the conversation this evening. And I'm going to kick it off by saying welcome to all of you for being here tonight. And welcome especially to Maurice and Dave for being here and gracing us with your wonderful stories and all of your experiences this evening. Really appreciate having you here. If you don't already know me, and I don't think I know anybody on tonight, I'm Megan Tulligman. I'm the Director of Programs at Indiana Humanities. We are a statewide nonprofit that's dedicated to supporting, funding, and doing everything we can to encourage Hoosiers to read, think, and talk. We're also the home of the Indiana Authors Awards, which is why we're here tonight. Every other year we organize an award process for Indiana authors that celebrate books published in the previous 2 years. And so I encourage you to check out indianaauthorsawards.org to see our most recent honorees and winners. Both Dave and Maurice were honored in this last round. And we also, through this program, really work on connecting Hoosier readers and writers. And so we do that in a variety of ways. We have a monthly book review column, and we also provide opportunities for authors that have been recognized by the Indiana Authors Awards to connect with audiences, usually at schools, libraries, and community organizations. And so right now we actually have an application open where you can apply to host an author at your organization. They're open through mid-November for programs happening next year. And my colleague Bronwyn, who's also on the chat with us tonight, she organizes that program and she's put some information about it in the chat. So I encourage you to look at the catalog of authors that are willing to do talks and workshops, and contact Bronwyn if you have questions about that program. So that's who I am, and a little bit about the Authors Awards, but we're thrilled to have been invited in tonight by Ben and the Indiana State Literacy Association. So Ben, I'm going to turn it over to you to say a little bit more about your organization.
Hi, my name is Ben Boki, and I'm the chair of the Indiana State Literacy Association, which is the state affiliate of the International Literacy Association. And part of our job is to basically spread the joy of literacy to anybody in the state of Indiana, but particularly our K-12 educators. So we're excited to host this event tonight. One part of our mission statement is to encourage and celebrate the children's right to read. And we think the best way to do that is to celebrate and learn more about the authors who are in our backyard. So we're thrilled to have John David Anderson and Maurice Broaddus here tonight to share basically what it's like to be an author and writing books for children and young adults. And they literally might live right next to you and you have no idea. But we're here to celebrate them tonight and also to talk about writing for children and all of that fun stuff. We are also so pleased tonight to give away some free books. So we are going to pick two lucky winners who are participating in tonight's event to give away books from John David Anderson and Maurice Broaddus. So I will contact you if you win. I'm going to literally pull your name out of a hat tonight. I don't have my magic wheel where it spins and then you get the winner, but I will be in touch with our two lucky winners tonight, and they will get some books from our two celebrated authors tonight. So we are so excited to be part of this, and thank you for coming.
Thanks, Ben. All right, so I think that takes care of all of our business, and now we can get to the fun stuff. So for our first introduction, I'm going to read both Maurice's and Dave's bios, because if I just started talking about their books and all the amazing things that they've done, you'd never actually hear from them. So forgive me a little bit of reading, but I feel as though both of you deserve the full introduction here. So Maurice is a community organizer and teacher. His work has appeared in magazines like Lightspeed Magazine, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, Asimov's Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and Uncanny Magazine, with some of his stories having been collected in The Voices of Martyrs. His books include the urban fantasy trilogy, The Knights of Brighton Court, the steampunk works Buffalo Soldier and Pimp My Airship, winner of the Indiana Authors Awards in 2020, and the middle grade detective novels, The Usual Suspects and forthcoming Unfadeable. His project Sorcerers is being adapted for a television show for AMC. As an editor, he's worked on Dark Faith, Fireside Magazine, and Apex Magazine, and you can learn more at mauricebroaddus.com. So thanks for being here, Maurice.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And then next up, we have John David Anderson, is a critically acclaimed middle grade novelist, lifelong Hoosier, and Indianapolis native. Our two speakers tonight have Indianapolis in common. His books for young people include One Last Shot, Finding Orion, Posted, Sidekicked, Miss Bixby's Last Day, and Granted, 2019-2020 Hoosier Young Hoosier Book Award finalist, and also an Indiana Authors Awards honoree as well. Graduate of Indiana University, he currently spends his free time hiking and biking through Fort Harrison Park with his family, searching for the most delicious root beer in the universe, jamming on his piano, and encouraging kids to read, which is very apt for this evening as well. So thank you for being here, Dave.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, sure. So I'm so excited to talk to both of you, because I feel like, and it might be a slightly strange statement looking at Maurice's full body of work, but your works have a ton in common. And as I was reflecting on that and kind of pre-reading for this, I was really reflecting on just how much we could have to talk about tonight. So I'm so excited to have this conversation. I thought I would kick it off though by asking you to talk a little bit more about yourselves. A bio doesn't entirely do you and all your work justice. So I was wondering if you could kick it off by sharing a little bit about yourself, where you're from and your connection to this place, and then giving our audience, if they haven't encountered your work before, giving them kind of a sense of your literary focus. Maurice, do you want to kick it off for us tonight?
Sure, sure. Originally, I was born in London, England, and then moved to Indianapolis when I was about 10 years old. Been here ever since. In fact, I've only recently, in the last 2 years, moved from the west side of Indianapolis, where I'd been like all my life. Let's see. I like to. I basically I have three jobs. I'm an accidental teacher and librarian at the Oaks Academy Middle School. I'm a science fiction and fantasy author, and I am the resident Afrofuturist at the Kepler Institute. And although I've been in publishing for about just over 20 years, mostly science fiction and fantasy, but to my middle school students, despite the dozen books I have out and the over 100 short stories published, my career boils down to 2.5 credits. I get a full credit for being the consultant on a video game called Watch Dogs 2. I get a full credit because I wrote a short story for the Black Panther anthology. And then I get half a credit for, writing a middle grade novel. So that's my entire career to my middle school students.
Thanks, Maurice. Dave, do you want to say a little more about yourself, your connection to this place, your literary focus?
Sure. I was born nowhere near as exotic as London, England, right here in Indianapolis, Indiana. I managed to get away for all of 7 years where I taught at the University of Illinois, but then I had kids and all of the grandparents sort of conspired together. They all lived here in Indianapolis and created a sort of vortex whirlwind, cyclone that swept us up and pulled us back. And so of my 46 years, 39 of them have been spent in Indianapolis. And I do love it here, actually. As far as my body of work goes, I exclusively write for middle grade. So for kids between the ages of 8 and 14, basically, anything that's at my maturity level, anything that's willing to deal with like deep existentialist philosophy, but also gets a fart joke. That's kind of like that's the Venn diagram of where I write. And like Maurice, I have written, science fiction and fantasy, but I also I'm a bit of a genre jumper. So I write realistic fiction. I've got, oh my gosh, I've got sports novels, and I've got, novels about cancer, and I've got dungeon diving and superheroes, and you name it. I just can't focus on any one thing for too long. I don't know how much street cred I've got. Probably not a whole lot, but I am addicted to Lego and chocolate, which are two things that a lot of my young readers can relate to.
I love it. Thanks for that background. Both of you have kind of superheroes in common. I'm already off. I sent, just so everybody's watching, I sent like very specific scholarly questions to our panelists beforehand, but I'm going to jump in to the superhero themes and just go completely off script. So I'm a little curious, Maurice, you've had this experience with Black Panther, Dave, you have at least 2 books that are superhero in theme, right? And maybe more than that. Can you talk about what it's like to work with those themes and why you're drawn to those? Either of you.
Yeah, I'll jump in because I'm actually more interested in what it's like for Maurice to actually take like an icon and be able to work with that, because I think that's really fascinating. Like I didn't have that kind of access to like high-powered superhero, iconography. I had to create my own. Lame. And so what I really liked about it was this notion of the dual world, right? And that in one world, you're essentially this powerless bystander. And then the other world, you have a great amount of agency, right? But then you also have all this increased responsibility that comes with it. And for me, writing middle grade, writing books, for like 12-year-olds, that's emblematic of like the very conflicted process that they're going through right now. Right? They start out as innocent bystanders. The world is fresh and new and exciting and full of rainbows, and then tragedy hits and conflict hits. They get old enough where they can actually maybe make a little bit of a difference to the world, but that's when the world becomes an even scarier place. So for me, the idea of taking superheroes, and especially because in my books, they are not actually the superheroes, they're the superhero sidekicks, or they're the minions to the villain. So they're not even like at the top of the tier. They're sort of working their way up, and then try to see through that point of view what it's like to grow up. And so what I think is even harder than keeping a villain from blowing up a city is asking the person that you know have a crush on to the dance, right? In some ways, that takes even more courage, I think. And playing with that juxtaposition and seeing how the transition to hero-dom works, not just in this great big super fiction life of superheroes, but how it also works in your own real world. Which I got to be honest, is why I think Superman is lame, and people like Batman and Black Panther are super cool, because Superman has like every power you could possibly want, and his weakness is a green rock, right, from outer space, and his main bad guy is a rich bald dude. I don't get it, right? Whereas all these other people, they have to work for a living, darn it. So, sorry, tangent.
All right. So the question is, what it's like to work with
Yeah,
Superman?
I was thinking about, I just knew that both of you would have this kind of, you've played with these tropes, these with superheroes, and I know you're passionate about Marvel, Maurice, so I just thought I'd bring it up early in the convo.
I mean, not just Marvel. I mean, okay, yeah, above me, there is a complete Black Panther cast in stuffed toys and everything. Sure, there's that. And we are in my office, and I am surrounded by my comic book collection of over 20,000 books. So there's that. But comic books was actually my gateway into writing, to be honest with you. I was in 5th grade, and my best friend, his mother was making him get rid of his comic books collection, and he didn't want to just give them, throw them away, so he gave them to me. And I remember holding the issue X-Men 136 in my hands for the first time, and within those pages, I fell in love. Superheroes were just the calling I never knew I had, and that began my my obsession with collecting comic books and that sort of thing, and that was what led me into, like I said, into the realm of story. It got me interested in reading. It got me interested in expanding my imagination and playing around and frankly just living in my imagination. I loved it. I was the kid who, I was just constantly reading, always reading, and so. And I attribute that to comic books, instilling that love of reading in me. So yeah. So then getting to play in those playgrounds of getting to write a Black Panther short story. I mean, that was like all the geek dreams come true. I just like, okay, I've come full circle. All right, I don't blame my kids for giving me that one credit. I'm like, okay, you know what? In my life, I consider that my main credit too. So there's that.
Yeah, that was kind of my sneaky way of, playing with the what your origin story was and how you came to be a writer. Maurice, you've given us a little bit of that story. Dave, could you talk a little bit about how you got started in your writing career?
I mean, I think like Maurice and just about every author that I've ever met in my entire life, I think we all got started as readers. Ultimately, we all got started falling in love with story in one way or another. For Maurice, it was comic books. For me, it was probably not until middle school or high school, and I fell in love with fantasy and a little bit science fiction. And I read Lloyd Alexander, was a big influence. And then when I was 16, I read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I was like reading parts of this book out loud to my friends and just cracking up, like practically peeing my pants. And they just didn't get it. Like they're like, why is this funny? I'm like, oh, this is the funniest thing that's ever been written, And so for Christmas that year, I asked my parents for a Brother word processor typewriter. It was like this pre-computer thing with this 3-line screen, right? And in order to print your work out, you had to feed individual sheets of paper through it, and then it would literally type it out. And on that thing, I wrote a 175-word novel. It was my very first long piece. And I finished it up and I printed it out, and it took about 8 hours, right? And I held it in my hands, and I thought, this is awesome. Like, I created this. This is out of my imagination. And then I looked at it and I'm like, oh no, Douglas Adams actually created this. I pretty much just copied everything that he did. And I didn't know what it was called at the time. Now looking back on it, I know that my very first novel was a work of fan fiction, right? And so I got my start copying off of those that I love. And I think that's where a lot of people get their start. And I think it's a perfectly acceptable way to do it. Styles you like and you emulate them, You find the genres that you love and you dabble in those genres first. So for me, that was fantasy and science fiction. And then as I grew to love more things, I grew to try more things. And so I think we follow obviously in the steps of our heroes, whether they're, Kurt Vonnegut or Douglas Adams or Black Panther, or you name it.
In fact, that ties in because in 2000, I finished my first novel. It's called Strange Fruit, and I was so proud of this thing, and it took me a year to revise the novel, but then I didn't know what to do with it at that point. Like, I have a completed book, I don't know what to do with it, and so I did what many people I'm sure do. They write their favorite comic book title at the time, and so I wrote. There was a comic book called Starman, and James Robinson was the writer of it at the time. And so I wrote him and just like, look, I finished a novel, but I don't know what to do next. And so back then, I think they might still do it, but they would print the letters in the actual comic book itself. And so they printed my letter, and James Robinson responded to it about maybe he ought to do an advice column for writers, but they also printed my address as a part of it. And then 2 weeks later, a writer from Chicago writes me. I get this letter in the mail, or another writer has written me, and he says, hey, the World Horror Convention is up in Chicago this year. Why don't you come up and I'll introduce you around? And that's how I got into publishing.
Wow, that is an incredible story. Because I have to say, coda to my story, I wrote that book when I was like 16, and I didn't get published until I was 30. So it was like a 14-year lag for me.
Right.
The advice was go write another book and then write another one and then write another one. And by the time you get to number 7, like maybe you'll be good enough to get something on the shelf.
Yep, yeah, because that was my first novel written, but my first novel that actually got published was the fifth novel I wrote, was the first one that got published.
Making me feel a little better, thank you.
Well, that does kind of dovetail on something else I wanted to ask you both. In particular, maybe you could reference like some of the genre jumping that you do within your work. So I was going to ask, a very typical question: where's your inspiration come from? Like, how do you get these ideas? But particularly, I think because you both, genre jump so much, how you choose the genre in which you want to address a particular theme, or what that process is like for you.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So like the first novel I wrote, like I said, that was a horror novel. But the first novel I got published was an urban fantasy, and it came out because at the time I was volunteering at an organization called Outreach Inc. It's a homeless teen ministry. And so I was working with a lot of the young people doing creative writing projects with them. And I think I threw out the line that something about reimagining all of our stories in different ways. And, what if we were kings and queens of the streets, and something along those lines. And then that notion just sort of stuck with me. And so I ended up doing a retelling of the legend of King Arthur, set in Indianapolis, except told through the eyes of homeless teens. And that was my Knights of Breton Court trilogy. And then frankly, my methodology hasn't really changed all that much. My ideas typically spring from being in community with folks. The Usual Suspects is basically the chronicles, is part chronicles of some of the students I work with, and but mainly the chronicles of my children, and some of the antics they pulled in school. Which is why I say I'm an accidental teacher, because that wasn't exactly my course. It's just that the sheer level of antics my kids were pulling in schools was causing me to be more and more involved with the administration, we'll just put it that way, until eventually the administration was like, hey, you know what? Can we just hire you full time to work with kids? Because the way you work with kids, it just can't be taught. And so I was just like, oh, sure. And so that's just been the pattern that follows me. I'm inspired by my community. I'm inspired by the people I hang out with. In fact, even my upcoming middle grade novel, Unfadeable, was inspired because I just got the letter from my editor saying, hey, we want another middle grade novel. And I just happened to be working with one of my mentees at the time. And then she's like, oh, Mr. Broaddus, I bet ideas are hard. And I'm like, no, ideas are the easy part. And I was just like, there, I just pitched you as a book. And then I just looked around the classroom, just started pitching all the kids in the classroom as different project ideas. And then it didn't take them a half hour before they came back with, hey, that Bella person, I think we want to read a whole novel about her. And I was just like, oh, great. Oh, it's gonna be tough living with her for a bit because she saw the email. She's like, Mr. Broaddus, they're gonna love me. And I'm like, okay, great. So yeah, so it's just a matter of, being in community and being touched by the people in your life and just having a careful eye for the world around you.
Dave, do you have thoughts on where your inspiration comes from, or how you kind of come up with your ideas or approach different genres?
I assume it's magic. I don't know, fairies, Greek muses. I think it's different with every book. I agree with everything Maurice said. I think a lot of it just comes from the world around you, both the close world, family and friends and the community, and then the bigger global concerns. I know I just finished a science fiction duology called Stowaway, and then the sequel to that, which finishes it off, comes out next summer, called Homebound. And I know that a lot of what went into that book ultimately was questions about our care of the world and the universe and environmental concerns. And obviously these are things that weigh upon our brains. And so I think whatever it is that's sort of pressing upon you, whatever's on your heart and in your head, it's going to find its way into your book, regardless of what genre you write. I tell people that, the old adage is write what you know. I'm like, that well, it can run dry sometimes. But if you always write what you feel, if you write to the emotions that you've experienced, if you write to the conflicts that you've been through, then I think you're going to create characters that people can relate to. And whether you're writing about superheroes, or whether you're writing about fairies, or whether you're writing about, people on an Arthurian quest. By the way, Maurice draws a lot of inspiration from his community, but he also referenced King Arthur, right? Which means that no matter who we are, we're still going back to the same stories that have been told for thousands and thousands of years. And I only bring that up because my novel, Miss Victory's Last Day, is also an Arthurian quest, right? It's a book all about the Fisher King and the quest for the Holy Grail, except for in this book, it's a cheesecake and the Fisher King's a teacher and whatever. But it's still sort of the same story, but we take our own modern concerns and we sort of overlap with that. In response to your question about genre, a lot of genre jumping for me is a desire to challenge myself. I just look and I say, what haven't I done yet? I haven't written one of these. And there are only two things that are currently off the table. I don't think I'll ever write a Western, and I'm not sure that I will ever write a romance novel. But you never know. Like, whatever the future holds, whatever the mortgage requires, that'll probably be where I go. But I'm gonna have to talk to Maurice about urban fantasy, because I haven't tried that yet. That might be pretty cool. Anyway, so yeah, I think it's important, and for teachers especially, talking to their students who are like, what do you write about now? To try and push on them to challenge themselves, to find a way to take what is their personal experience and their personal story, and maybe shove it in a genre or a setting or a circumstance that doesn't quite match up, right? So if you're dealing with the loss of a loved one, right, then how would you imagine that as a fantasy story? And then that can give them an easy way in, because they know fantasy stories. Fantasy stories have dragons and swords and wizards and stuff. So I start with that, and then I add all my personal emotional stuff to it, and then the story will resonate.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot right now about the kind of world building you both do too, to focus on kind of one genre that you both work in. Thinking about the amount of detail that you give to a fairy world at the beginning of Granted, Dave, like the intricacy of how these fairies go out in the world and grant wishes. And then Maurice, your steampunk treatment of Indianapolis, and how you've actually thought about the geography of the city and how you would lay a steampunk system on top of that. When you approach, how do you approach, I guess, doing that kind of world building? Do you have a process? Do you just play until it feels right? How do you it's so impressive to me when I read it. I can't even imagine what the actual process in creating is like.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay. So well, the setting, the world is for me is another character in the book, in the story. And so, and Indianapolis is one of my favorite characters. And so basically I end up playing dress up with Indianapolis in a whole bunch of different ways. And so like, even with the Knights of Breton Court in that trilogy, you know, the world of Indianapolis is a world filled with magic. And the magic then is actually a metaphor for homelessness. It's in front of us all the time if you know what you're looking for. And so I use magic as a metaphor for that. And the city is then divided up by ley lines. And that explains a lot of the different pockets of how Indianapolis developed in that world. In Pimp My Airship, it was just like, I wanted an excuse to delve more into the history of Indianapolis. I was going around and collecting all of these sort of hidden stories from my neighbors as they describe different neighborhoods that they grew up in or their parents grew up in. And I became fascinated with how people moved from one space to another, how different spaces evolved in the city and why that could have been. And so Pimp My Airship became my through line, that I could examine all of that history and the why people are in the different pockets that they are. Now it's a bit more of a challenge with my next novel, Sweep of Stars. Sweep of Stars is the first of a trilogy of a space opera, as I've jumped genre yet again. And so it's a space trilogy. And so, you know, and someone asked me, you know, well, you love Indianapolis, so how are you going to get Indianapolis into a space opera? And I'm like, challenge accepted. And so so it was one of those things. Indianapolis actually has the same layout as Washington, D.C., right? So it was a simple matter for me to just, you know, wipe out the East Coast, and then we need a new capital. And so Indianapolis becomes the new capital, not just of the country, but, you know, it's going to be the capital of Earth, period. And so now I get Indianapolis in the middle of my space opera, so I can still continue doing that sort of thing. So that, you see, so sometimes the world building is me going out of my way to put Indianapolis back onto the stage. But with Sweep of Stars, the other thing about that world building for that is I took a year and a half to do the world building for that book, and that was me sort of dreaming. I call it dreaming alongside my neighbors, as I would go to people and say, hey, what would it look like for us in the future to build a community, an intergalactic community on our terms, you know, free of the weight of history, free of oppressive systems. If we were to do everything from the ground up, brand new, what could it look like? And so I just spent a year and a half dreaming alongside my neighbors to come up with this world. And that was the basis of Sweep of Stars. So for me, world building is just an excuse to one, play with Indianapolis, and two, dream with my friends.
I love that. Thanks, Maurice. Dave, do you have a way in which you approach world building?
Very painfully. You know that it's science fiction when Indianapolis is the capital of the entire world, right? You know that somebody has definitely engaged their imagination in high gear. I love that. Yeah, for me, it's not an easy process at all because when I start a novel, I'm primarily focused on conflict and character. It's the voices inside my head that are trying to get out. They're dealing with all their personal stuff. So literally setting for me in a first draft is like town, house. And then I just jump right into dialogue, or somebody punches somebody, or, you know, friendships fall apart. Something active has to happen. And so world building then sort of slowly eats in from draft to draft. As I step away from myself and put myself in my reader's shoes. Because the first time I write a draft of anything, I'm only writing for one person. I'm writing just to satisfy me and the kind of reader that I am and the things that I'm most interested in. And it really takes some space for me to step outside and be like, yeah, of course you can see that. It's in your head, right? But they have no idea. And, you know, I also trust readers that if you show them, you know, just a little bit, they'll be able to fill in the rest. So for me, it's always just a challenge to figure out what that little bit is. And so what I'll then do is I'll start by underwriting and not including any world building. And then I'll build the heck out of that world And they're like, I overdid it. The whole thing's about to collapse like a Jenga tower. And then I have to scale it back and take out everything that was completely superfluous, which turns out to be quite a lot of it. So it's a negotiation. Like, all writing, of course, is a process, but for me, that is definitely one that takes lots of stages.
Yeah, Maurice, you talked a little bit about incorporating, in thinking about the world, incorporating Indianapolis so much. What is it, since we're all likely Hoosiers on the Zoom here tonight, what is it about Indianapolis or Indiana that appeals to you, that you, a lot of people want to write their way out of Indiana. Why do you, continue to write your way into it?
Well, for me, Indianapolis in particular is America in microcosm. It just is. All the issues that have beset America, all the weight of history, all of the different things that have woven themselves into the fabric of our nation is crystallized here in Indianapolis, and that's one of the things I love about it. I mentioned finding the secret stories. There was one time when I was talking to a neighbor, and he was because I was on his bridge, as he declared, and so he was talking to me about the history of Riverside Park, and how he and his family were only allowed into Riverside one day a year, and only if they collected enough bottle caps during the course of the year. So I'd hear stories like that, or I'd hear stories, from other neighbors about, just actually the stories of joy that go unreported or underreported, and I'm just like, why isn't this brought to the forefront? So it's a combination of what are the things that go unreported, that are neighborhood level stories that don't get to be that aren't told, or aren't put on a large enough platform for people to hear. It's like I want to share those stories. I want to share those memories of what's like growing up in the neighborhood. I want to hear. I want to hear those. One of my other favorite things in Indianapolis is those haunted tours. I ain't gonna lie. All the different haunted sections of Indianapolis, I am there every time. I want to hear every last haunted place in the city. In fact, Pin My Airship started with a different tour. I was taking a tour of the catacombs, and then I suddenly got inspired for this whole idea of an undercity beneath Indianapolis, because I love this city. I love the identity of this city. I think there's a lot about Indianapolis that's also aspirational, and I love that about us. And so I don't know, I just fall in love with all of it, and so I just want to write about it, all of it.
That's awesome. Dave, do you have similar Hoosierness expressing itself in your books? Do you see that inspiration or that effect anywhere?
I've actually never included in all of my work, I have only once mentioned a real place. And that is in my book, Finding Orion, the family goes to Casey, Illinois. And the only reason I had to include it is because, there's like a giant pencil there, and a giant mailbox, and it was just a stop that fit really well with the story. Otherwise, I just create fictional versions of places that I've been, so that nobody can yell at me and tell me that I got the street name wrong, because then they're going to find enough stuff to nitpick about. That said, what I think connects Maurice and I is this idea that Indiana and Indianapolis, and maybe even other parts of the Midwest, is sort of like a microcosm. Like, it's very malleable. You can pretty much find anything you need to here, and set any conflict here, and it resonates, right? We have, I think, every end of the spectrum, and especially Indianapolis, it's got big city problems and small city feels and all of those things. And so I like that kind of amorphous nature of it. And the other thing I'll say is that I do think I tend to write characters who are a little more reticent, who are a little more inward looking, who tend not to, complain too much about their problems, and they don't just jump right into things. And I think that comes from how I was raised and a little bit of my Midwestern values. If I had been raised in New York, for example, maybe my characters would be a little more gung-ho, a little more brash, right? They, jump into the fray with a little more speed than my Midwestern protagonists do. And I don't think there's any way that an author can fully escape the values and the concerns that they grew up with. Right? I think it's going to trickle into our writing one way or another, whether it does it explicitly, and we make Indianapolis king of the world, or it does it implicitly in my case, and we just have a bunch of mopey characters running through cornfields or whatnot. Either way, it's going to find its way in.
I feel obliged to ask that Indiana question. I think it's like in my work, it's the thesis I'm after. Like, what is it about this place? Like, how do you define it? All of those things. So I always have to ask that question. Since a lot of our audience tonight are likely teachers, librarians, people that are working with young people and trying to get them to read, I think both of you have a ton of experience in the classroom. Dave, you presenting, and Maurice, you actually being in a classroom day to day. I'm curious, what it's been, how young readers have connected to your work, and have you ever been surprised, or is there anything you found interesting in their responses to your work?
I'm sure Maurice has more to say about this than I do, because I do a ton of school visits, and I'm always thankfully interacting, but I am not in the trenches day in and day out. So I'll do the cursory thing, and just say that it's probably the chief motivating factor for why I do what I do anymore. Like a lot of authors, there were visions of fame and fortune and gold cars and whatnot, in vacation houses in Italy. Those didn't pan out. So instead, I found joy in making that connection with young readers and getting them to open a book instead of stare at an iPad. And for me, I think the most rewarding connections are when the young readers turn out to be young writers as well. And when they come up to me and they pitch me their story ideas, right? And desperately try to get me to read the whole thing. And I'm like, I got a 10-page limit, man. I got my own stuff to write. But I love it when they identify as writers too. They're like, you're a writer, I'm a writer, because now all of a sudden we're on equal footing. And we are on equal footing, right? We both have imaginations, we both have dreams, aspirations. And so the connections with the young writers are probably the ones that I try to cultivate the most. And when I'm doing school visits, those are the times that I appreciate. I mean, I'll stand up there in front of a crowd of 300 or 400 students, and I'll be a cheerleader and I'm like, yay, reading, yay, writing, go imagination. But then if I can get into a room with like 20 young kids who really want to tell their story and give them just one or two tools to make that story a little better, then that for me is the greatest reward.
Yeah, that's it. That's what it boils down to. I was trying to think through the different experiences I've had. I remember my first book tour was with the other branches of the Oaks Academy. I took a tour of all the 5th grade classes to do presentations about The Usual Suspects in front of them, and I was just like, oh man, this is a whole thing, because that's I started this rule about when I'm talking to middle school students, like, if you're bold enough to ask the question, I'll be bold enough to answer it, which is a rule I may have to rethink moving forward. But I mean, The Usual Suspects itself came about because I wanted to, when it was all said and done, like my boys in their act of rebellion are not readers. But I mean, as rebellion goes, if that's their big rebellion issue, okay, I can live with that. Although I couldn't, and now that I think about it, because I was like, all right, challenge accepted. I'm going to write something that will get you to read. And that was the challenge of The Usual Suspects. It's like, hey, I'm going to write this book. And then my oldest son, I said, by the way, I'm talking about you and your brother in this book. And he's like, well, then I should be your editor. And I was like, okay. So then he became my editor for the book. And so he went through it all and would make his suggestions and all that kind of stuff. And then, before he realized it, he had read a whole novel. And I'm like, okay, there we go. Mission accomplished. And so, and that was actually the only reason I wrote Usual Suspects, is just later on, because I wrote it and then put it in my trunk, which is the same thing that happened with Pin My Airship. I wrote it and put it in my trunk because I wrote it for different reasons than actually trying to get published. And then, as it turns out, circumstances happen and it ended up becoming published. But then when Unfadeable, when I was asked to write Unfadeable, I sat down, I was just like, oh man, this is I've chosen something kind of tough to try and do for kids. And so, you know, one of my students was right there going, you know, Mr. Broaddus, and she, you know, she is a big reader, and she's like, Mr. Broaddus, I'll help you. I'm like, okay, here's the rough draft. Tell me what you think of it. And so she takes the book home, takes my manuscript home, comes back the next day, and it's like, hey, Mr. Broaddus, you know, I circled all the boring parts for you. And yeah, I've never seen so much red in my life. Which also means, you know what, I don't fear like a New York Times review or anything, because if you've been reviewed by middle schoolers, oh no, oh, reviews hold no fear for me anymore. But that's it. For me, it's always been making those one-on-one connections with my readers, making those small group connections with my readers. One of my big joys over the summer was doing, thanks to Indiana Humanities actually, doing the CLD's Amani Book Club, where they read The Usual Suspects as their book. And then I got to engage with those minds about how they saw themselves in the book and all that kind of thing. And so that for me is what it's all about. And so, you know, and I'll still do things like, well, one time I did do a creative writing club at the school. I haven't been able to do it again since, just because my schedule's been so taxed. But it's just like Dave said, you know, you get those people, those students who just like, hey, I have a story to tell. And I'm like, yes, you do. So let's get that story out there. And so I love working with students and helping them get their stories out. Like Dave said, give them the tools to tell their own stories, because, you know, that's the name of the game. When all said and done, you know, like I said, we come back to telling these tales over and over again, you know, centuries, you know, in the retellings. So what are we actually adding? So we're adding our own unique voice to that canon of stories. And that's what I remind my students. It's like, it's about adding your voice. You have something to say, you have something you care about. So let's get that out.
That's, I was so struck with, you know, in kind of reviewing and thinking through both your books about the way in which kind of the classroom or the interactions between these young people, they just felt, from what I could remember, so real to me. So I was just very curious to kind of hear from you about, you know, how kids respond. You know, did they say like, no, you got it all wrong, or, you know, yes, this really is how it is. And it was just, it was really fun to get back into that headspace and read. And I was just curious how that went. So I want to encourage folks in the audience to either use the Q&A in the chat to ask questions. We have about a little under 15 minutes left. So if there's anything you're dying to know, please put that in the chat or the Q&A. And while people are typing up their questions, since we do have, you know, teachers, librarians here today that are looking to, you know, promote reading, inspire students, do you have any tried and true tactics, like what works, what doesn't? And, you know, I know both of you have done a ton of classroom visits, and I think that might be one concrete way to think about how to engage authors in a classroom for some of these folks too. So anything that's worked well for you?
I just have to jump in here with this. Because when Maurice said that his sons were not avid readers, I have twins, 16-year-old twins, and while they were avid readers when they were younger, yeah, the pull of all these other things has torn them away from that, right? So here you have two authors with kids who are reluctant maybe to open a novel, and we're going to tell teachers and librarians how to encourage other kids to read. I'm just saying, anything I say, you probably already know, and you already do better than I've ever done, let's be honest. But here's what I do believe. I think that we need to celebrate reading at half the power that we celebrate other things, right? I mean, there are pictures of, you know, you name NFL quarterbacks, right? There's pictures of LeBron James or, you know, Steph Curry in kids' bedrooms, right? Why not a picture of Maurice Broaddus, right? Or Jason Reynolds, right? Or Kurt Vonnegut. I have a Kurt Vonnegut doll sitting on my desk, right? So I think there's something to be said for just valuing reading in books and emulating that. I know that I've been in contact with lots of teachers who just like, you know, just send me a message, just anything. just a little recording, just, your signature, whatever it is, that shows like that this is a greater community out there, that kids can be a part of, right? And so that's one thing, like create a community. If there's any way that we can create more reading communities and sort of dissociate them from assessment and tests and quizzes and all that stuff, to just make them about the joy of reading, like that's what I would like to see more of. And I know it's hard, right? I know you have curriculum and you have standards and you have all these things that you have to get to, but to create some kind of space where it is all about just engaging with that fiction and then sharing it with each other. If you think about what adults do, they break open a bottle of wine and they sit and they talk about a book for an hour. Like, why don't kids do that without the wine, right? Just substitute chocolate milk. And let's create, more reading clubs and more battle of the books, and get on websites like Biblionasium where they can write their own reviews of books and share them with each other. I think those communities are actually key to convincing other young people that reading is not as lame as they think it is, right? I'm not going to go so far as to say it's cool. I think it's cool, right? But I don't want to push that hard. But let's face it, it's really cool, right? But they're not going to take that from us. Like, they have to hear that from each other. So you have to create that space where they can share that message.
Yeah, I know whenever I do school visits, one of the first things I do is I actually check in with the teachers and the librarians to see if there's any particular notes they want me to touch on when I'm talking to the students, because I look at it this way. It's one thing like when the parents are the teachers are like parents, and it's one thing when your mom or dad tell you to do something, and it's another when your favorite uncle comes in and tells you the exact same thing. And I am literally on a panel right now. My youngest son just came in shirtless and dancing, so that's a visual none of us should actually need. But so I always check in with them first to see if there's something they want me to talk about, and almost always it comes down to revision. They always want me to, like, hey, talk about the revision process when it comes to writing, and I'm just like, okay, sure, give me that hard work to talk about. And so, but we'll manage to make it fun and do that ride. But before I even get to that point about revision, it's always about connecting with the kids and going, hey, you know what? You are in this story. You are seen and you are known. And what that means to the students to go, no, I see each and every one of you. And so, like, even with my own students, it's like we have 250 kids at the school. That means I have 250 curriculums because each one is tailored to that one student. And so we've been talking a lot as colleagues at the school, what does it look like to create a culture of reading? That's been our big talking point for the year. What does it look like to create a culture of reading, to allow students, time to just browse, or allow them to just read by their interest for fun? Again, like Dave said, away from the idea of assessment, but just to find something that speaks to you and then engage with it. And then us to engage them with why they chose that book and what they love about it. Hey, tell me why you love that book. Middle schools have no shortage of need, like, oh wait, you need to hear from me on this? Oh, I got you, and then don't get me wrong, that's a commitment you have to make, because you're probably going to be there 10 minutes, 15, half hour as they engage. The amount of times they want me to read their anime stuff, but I will do that because that's what's speaking to them. That's what they love. And it's like, all right, well, tell me about it, I guess. And we'll have those conversations because, they light up when they're talking about it. And I'm like, all right, you know what? Now you've caught me up in it. Tell me about it. Let's do this. And then the whole idea of just modeling this. So I think one of the biggest things I do in the school is I just sit there and I'm doing my job. I'm writing my next book in front of the students. Like, hey, Mr. Broaddus needs some quiet time now because Mr. Broaddus is on deadline. But that gets them involved in the process, because sometimes they want to know, well, what are you doing? And well, we're writing. In fact, if you're going to keep interrupting me, you're going to help me write this book. And and so I'll have them break down characters for me. Like, and so they'll detail characters. If you detail me a good enough character, I'll stick them in the book, which is why I think Sweeper Stars is going to have a bloated cast, because there were a lot of students giving me input. But, you know, it's all about modeling these things. I model as a parent, I model as a teacher, I model as a fellow writer, so that the kids can see that, you know, we can demystify the process for one thing and just make it very real. It's just like, hey, I have things I care about too that I want to say. And this is a great vehicle for me to get my ideas out there. Same thing works for you.
That's great. We had a follow-up to something you said, Maurice. Do teachers or librarians ever ask you not to talk about certain topics with kids when you're on these visits?
I guess that last belies the answer. Yeah, well, it's not something they don't tell me in advance. I can tell when I'm going into my stories. They're like, there's this look of panic in their eyes when it's just like, and now here are some of the things my sons pulled in school, some of the stunts that they pulled, and then you get that teacher high sign of like, maybe not let's not give them ideas. And I'm just like, well, I'll pull back a little, but a lot of the ideas are still in the books themselves, because there's a reason why the book's called The Usual Suspect. They have pulled some things, and but then it actually, and that's my hook for getting getting the students on my side, because it's like, hey, here are the antics I pulled in school, here are the antics my kids pulled in school, you know, now I have you and I have the students on my side, and then it allows me room to have the dialogue of, but hey, you know what, the conversation I had with the one who was just dancing a second ago, you know, there's a reason why you haven't developed the reputation you have. So where's that boundary line between what you have cultivated with your own antics versus the system prejudging you and putting a label on you? How do you walk that tension? And those are some pretty heady concepts for students. The whole idea of being prejudged or profiled, or almost like this. You know, these are actually the conversations we're having, but we're capable of having it because, one, look at middle school students should never be underestimated for how smart they are. Like even my editor would come down on me because she was like, "Oh, I don't know. This seems awfully sophisticated for middle school students." I'm like, "Well, you should see what they get up to these days. You should never underestimate middle school students." And so I say all that to go that I don't really get the high sign too often, as long as I pull back enough before I go over the cliff of, "Hey kids, y'all ought to be doing this too." As long as I pull back enough to weave it into, hey, as you know, speaking, you know, on behalf of parents and educators, I know how to do that line too, where I can pull it back and like, all right, now here's the actual life lessons from these stories.
Yeah. Being respectful of our time, we have one more question in the chat, and then I want to make sure you have opportunities for shameless plugs of your upcoming work that you're excited about. So first question, always one of my favorite questions: what books are on your nightstand now? So what are you reading? And then a second, you know, what are you up to next? What do you have coming out, and what projects are you most excited about right now?
I'll go ahead and go because give Maurice a little bit of a breather there. What is on my nightstand right now is David Sedaris's second volume of his journal entries. I think he's just absolutely hilarious. And a lot of times I like to read it in a sort of format or a style which is so completely different from my own, just to see how language is working, right? Just to see how we're playing with the very basics of like sentence construction and you know, what makes for a good effective paragraph and stuff like that. So, you know, to be reading Sedaris's journal entries, which are pretty far from, you know, narrative fiction, but from somebody who's mastered that form, and to see him play with language and all that stuff, it's a blast. And then I just finished, if I can be able to think of it, The Beatrice Prophecy, I believe by Kate DiCamillo, because, you know, I always try to keep up with things that are happening in my own middle grade sphere. In terms of my own stuff coming out, I have a novel. I just came out with a novel in August. It was called Stowaway. It's science fiction. It's space opera. Like Maurice, we're both dabbling in this. I don't know, Maurice, if you're a Star Wars fan, but that was definitely, and I know you're into comic books, but Star Wars was my Marvel when I was that age. So that's what got me immersed into mythology and storytelling and world building and all that stuff. And so I definitely wanted to do that. It just took a long while to get on it. And then I have a novel coming out in January, which is called Riley's Ghost, which is my first ghost story / horror novel, set in a middle school, which becomes the equivalent of a haunted house, except there's two ghosts in this one that are sort of competing for the protagonist's attention, and she has to decide basically which side she's going to stand on, right, and what she's going to do to lay these ghosts to rest. And it deals with a lot of the things that middle schoolers are dealing with. There's concerns about bullying and friendship and family responsibilities and all that stuff. So again, yet another genre to add to the list. We'll see if I did a halfway decent job. Maybe I'll write another one. And then the sequel to Stowaway comes out next summer, and that's Homebound. And doing dishes, finishing the laundry.
Great. Maurice, how about you?
Let's see. So my stack is divided into two piles. So there's my stuff I'm reading, my nonfiction stuff that I'm reading to help fuel the ideas for books. I got like Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon, Generation Kill, which is about the Desert Storm, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humanity, reinventing organizations. Yeah, I got all sorts of random like nonfiction stuff that goes on in my that fuels a lot of my work. The active fiction books on my nightstand, N.K. Jemisin's. There's always going to be an N.K. Jemisin book, even when I've gone through them all, though I'll just go start rereading them. But right now it's How Long Till Black Future Month, her short story collection. I got Victor Laval's The Changeling. I'm reading Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, and then R.K.D. Martin's A Memory Called Empire, as a and then The New Sons, which is a short story collection, a short story anthology by Nisi Shaw. So those are some of the active things on my reading list. Let's see. Then the two. Besides, I have 6 upcoming short stories that are coming out over the next few months. And then in March is Sweep of Stars, my space opera. It has the 3 different sets of characters. One set with the community known as Muungano. Their leader has fallen, and so the community has to wrestle with who's going to speak for their community moving forward. Another set of characters is on a starship called the Cypher, which in this universe, the starships are powered by jazz music. Because and then there's also the third storyline involves a military unit which has gone through a wormhole and only to discover that they are not alone in the universe. So that's a Sweep of Stars, and then my next middle grade book, Unfadeable, which features a young heroine named Bella. But she's a neighborhood detective, and so she is uncovering some of the she's just trying to get some funding to do an arts program in her community, and then she comes to have to go up against a lot of the powers when in city politics when it comes to trying to get things done. And so I'm really looking forward to see. And then she just in the messy ways that middle school students investigate, she does all of those things. But it's a story about agency and what it means to claim your agency and move through the world with your own agency, with the power of your own agency. So.
Amazing. I can't wait to read all of the things. Thank you both. We are just over time, so I'm going to say good evening and say thank you to John David Anderson and Maurice Broaddus for being here tonight. Ben, do you have any final words you want to offer to folks tonight?
No, I thought this was amazing, and so I hope you did too. And I'm going to put a plug in for you to fill out a grant to bring John David Anderson and Maurice Broaddus to your neighborhood. So I just want to call you guys on the phone and be like, so let's just talk. So that's awesome.
Yeah, any questions about that program, you can folks in the audience can email me or Bronwyn, and we can and she just put the link in the chat for how you can post Dave and Maurice. All right, thank you all so much. Thanks to our presenters. Thanks to the folks here and to the folks that watch the recording. Have a good evening.